Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Michael Friedrich. I work here at the National Network for Safe Communities in the Research and Policy Shop. And I just want to thank you all for being here. I want to start us off on this panel. It's the New Science and Research New Science and Research in Violence. I'll keep this pretty short so we can jump right into the topic. But I think it's safe to say we're all in this room because we care deeply about what the social science shows about violence and about what works to reduce violence. So we're really privileged to have this group of speakers who've made enormous recent contributions to the body of evidence and knowledge about violence dynamics and intervention. This research has informed the way the National Network thinks about the work we're doing with our partners on the ground. And it's about particularly how violence concentrates among certain populations and among certain places, what makes interventions effective at preventing violence, and how practitioners can make their efforts more timely and more responsive to what they're seeing on the ground. Moderating our panel today is Thomas Abt of Harvard, who will also be presenting on his recent USAID-sponsored meta-review of violence interventions. We have Ben Green of Harvard, who will present on important research he's conducted on networks of shooting victimization, and particularly what's being called cascades of shootings. We have Danielle Wallace of Arizona State University, and she'll present on her evaluation of the Chicago PSN intervention to reduce violence and recidivism among gun parolees. And finally, we have George Wood of Yale, and he's sharing with us his work on spillover, or the second-order effects of the Chicago violence reduction strategy. So we want to thank them. We're really pleased to have them here with us today. And without further ado, I'll kick it off and have Thomas set us up with the topic. Let's give them a round of applause to start.
All right. Thank you so much, Michael. It's a pleasure to be back here at John Jay, here at the annual conference, and with all of you today. As you heard from Michael, I'll be your first presenter and also the moderator. First, I'll spend a few minutes talking about a paper that I did with sociologist Christopher Winship at Harvard, a paper that we published last year to give some broad overview of the issues, and then we'll dive into our presentations with some time left over for questions. I'm going to try to keep us on schedule and on time, and so I've warned my co-panelists in a very friendly way that they are going to in fact be limited to 15 minutes each, and so if you see me nudging or signing to them, that's just my friendly way of keeping us all on track so that we have plenty of time for questions from all of you. With that, let's just begin, and let's begin with the science generally. Much has been said about evidence-based policy, about its benefits and about its drawbacks. Personally, I prefer the term evidence-informed policy because it serves as a reminder that policy can never be exclusively based on science alone. In the area of violence reduction, we should be aiming for policies that are fully informed by the best evidence and data available at the time. We should really be using science, in my view, to improve public policy decision-making, not to replace public policy decision-making. So, what does the science tell us about how best to reduce violence? In short, what works? That's a question that Chris and I asked ourselves as we began our study. And to answer that question, we conducted a systematic meta-review, or a review of reviews, that covered over 1,400 individual evaluations of anti-violence programs. We also went around the country to examine the strongest programs up close so that we could really get under the hood to see why they were so effective. To our knowledge, this was the first time anyone had ever comprehensively addressed this question using both quantitative and qualitative approaches. So here's what we found. A few interventions, such as focused deterrence and cognitive behavioral therapy, exhibited moderate to strong effects on crime and violence and were strongly supported by the evidence. Those were the clear winners of our study. A few others, such as scared straight and gun buyback programs, clearly demonstrated either no or even negative effects, and those were the big losers. Most of the programs we studied, however, were neither clear winners or clear losers. They had weak or modest effects on violence, and the science behind them was not particularly strong. This is often known as the promising but not proven category, or the needs more study category of anti-violence programming. We knew even before we started that success in reducing violence was about more than just picking the right set of programs. So we looked deeper and tried to identify what the most successful anti-violence programs had in common. And we came up with 6 essential elements of effectiveness to guide the field in choosing and implementing what works best when it comes to fighting crime and violence. So I'm going to run through those 6 elements now. The first is specificity. Everything we've learned from social science over the past 30 years tells us that violence is sticky, meaning that it clusters together. In the United States, community or street violence is highly concentrated in every jurisdiction among a few micro-locations or hotspots, among a few key actors that we often call shooters, and around a small set of bad habits or risky behaviors, like belonging to a gang, carrying a gun, or abusing alcohol. The most successful programs were very specific. They weren't looking at all violence, but focusing only on where violence was most concentrated. Successful programs worked on the hardest, most dangerous cases and left the easier stuff to others. The second principle or element of effectiveness is proactivity. In order to reduce violence over the long run, waiting for violence to happen and then cleaning up after the fact is simply not a workable anti-violence solution. Successful anti-violence efforts were proactive in that they tried to prevent violence ahead of time whenever possible, either through deterrence or prevention. In order to be proactive, these efforts were often relentless in terms of outreach, working hard to meet the highest risk populations where they were at and then engaging them respectfully. Relatedly, the third principle is legitimacy. In order to reduce violence over the long run, you need the support of the community. And while you can use tough enforcement to temporarily deter crime, enforcement alone won't build trust and confidence. Emerging evidence is making clear that there is an important connection between legitimacy and violence. And this is something I look forward to hearing more from with Danny. And in some ways, I would say this is potentially one of the most interesting new areas of study in the anti-violence field, is this study of the connection between legitimacy and violence. When communities don't trust the authorities, they don't use them, deciding disputes using the code of the street, often with violence. And the best anti-violence strategies that we reviewed were perceived as legitimate by the community, by the victims, but even by the perpetrators themselves. The fourth principle or element is capacity. When it comes to programmatic performance, as many of us know already, it all comes down to 3 things: implementation, implementation, and implementation. Even the best designed interventions will fail if they're not supported properly. Poor training, sudden changes in leadership, and insufficient funding will stop a program in its tracks. And the best programs were all excellent at avoiding these pitfalls and in implementing effectively. The fifth principle was one that surprised me. I wasn't anticipating. And we call it theory. And it goes along with capacity. The best programs had well-defined, well-understood theories of change. They knew what they were doing and why they were doing it. And they had spent a lot of time thinking it out, writing it out, and modeling it out. Doing the hard work of thinking through your program is critical for both implementation and evaluation. If you don't have a clear vision of what you're doing and why you're doing it, it's hard to track your performance. Finally, partnership. Successful programs don't exist in a vacuum. No one can be successful all by themselves. And the best programs had great relationships and were actively engaged with others who were working on these same problems. So there you have it. Selectivity, proactivity, legitimacy, capacity, theory, and partnership. You can use these principles when choosing to choose the right program, to evaluate your own program, or to develop new ones. It's also important to note that no single program can address high rates of violence on their own. When you think about the work of the national network, you'll see that success follows wherever these principles are present. And where the network has faltered, it's generally been because one or more of these principles, usually either capacity or partnership, was missing. So with that, let's turn to our panelists, and let's begin with Ben Green.
Great. Thanks. Cool.
Sure.
Thanks for the introduction, Thomas and Michael, and thanks for coming out, everyone. Really great to be here. I'm Ben Green. I'm a Ph.D. candidate in the Applied Math Department at Harvard. I'm going to be talking about modeling contagion through social networks to explain and also predict gunshot violence. This is a study over an 8-year period in Chicago from 2006 to 2014. And it's joint work between myself with Thibaut Harel, who's also at Harvard, and Andrew Papachristos, who's in the Yale Sociology Department. So just as background, we wanted to take this frame of gun violence as an epidemic. Now, I'm sure many of you have heard gun violence described as an epidemic, but it's actually rarely modeled or evaluated as such. When it is analyzed as an epidemic, it's often thought about as what's known as an airborne pathogen, and kind of it's modeled spatially from neighborhood to neighborhood or block to block, and thought about the spread of gun violence is thought about through geography. The way that you might catch a cold, it's an airborne pathogen. But this may not make sense, and even the studies that analyze gun violence in this way suggest that whether it's gangs or drug markets, there's some sort of interpersonal behavior that's driving this spread. And so we wanted to take that and think about, could we model gun violence not as an airborne pathogen that you catch by being in a dangerous neighborhood, but as a bloodborne pathogen that you catch by engaging in certain behaviors with certain people. Examples of bloodborne pathogens are sexually transmitted diseases or from needle sharing and things like that. Behaviors where you are engaging with another person based on your relationships and the social connections that you're embedded in. And there's a lot of recent research that would suggest that this is a promising approach. Social networks have been studied across numerous domains over the last decade or so especially, and diffusion processes have been shown to be incredibly important and influential, and oftentimes processes that have previously been thought of as geographic, when the social networks are analyzed, it turns out that the network structure is actually underlying what seemed to be a geographic process. Furthermore, recent research in gun violence, much of it done by Andy Papachristos, has shown that gun violence concentrates in social networks, and some preliminary evidence that victims are clustered near to other victims, and that how many other victims are in your social network increases your likelihood yourself to become a victim of gun violence. So we wanted to extend this research, combine these two threads of dynamics of contagion over social networks, as well as networks of crime and violence, and see if we could uncover the temporal dynamics of how gun violence spreads through social networks. So to do this, we looked at Chicago, as I mentioned, over an 8-year period, and we pulled together two pretty large comprehensive data sets from the Chicago Police Department. The first was a data set on all of their arrest records, over 1 million arrest records totaling over almost 500,000 unique individuals over that period. And then a second data set on gunshot victimizations of which individuals had been shot, both fatal and non-fatal, over that period. And for that, we have almost 15,000 different individuals who had been shot. And from this first data source, from the arrest records, we're able to create what's known as a co-offending network. It's a social network that connects people based on who they've been arrested with, a behavior known as co-offending. So, we have this raw data source that comes in from the police department that shows arrests, both incidents and individuals. We're able to take that and create a network that connects, on this chart you see behind me, in the middle, there's a network that can connect individuals to the incidents in which they are arrested. And then finally, you can connect through those arrest incidents to connect individuals to one another. So what we have is, for all of these arrest records, a social network of who has been arrested with whom. So we took the largest component of this network, a connected component of about 140,000 people, that 10,000 of whom had been victims of gun violence, and there were about 11,000 victimization events total, considering that some individuals had been shot multiple times over this period. The plot behind me, you see a 2D visualization of this network. The blue dots are individuals who have not been shot. The red dots are the victims. And you can see that there's a pretty clear clustering of red dots of victims in this network, which is pretty, just again showing what has been found in previous studies, that victims are clustered in this network topographically. You can see the streaks of red throughout the image. The question that we wanted to answer was, are these victims also clustered in time? What are the patterns by which these red dots appear on the network? So to do this, we had to find a way to model a contagion process over the social network. We used a technique known as a Bayesian-Hawkes process. Hawkes processes are really just a form of point process. A Poisson process is kind of your most basic. And this approach of Hawkes processes and the Bayesian approach that we took more generally has been used a great deal over the past 10 years in the machine learning and social networks community to infer large-scale patterns of diffusion and influence over social networks, oftentimes looking at the spread of information over the internet and trying to figure out, say, which websites are infecting or providing information to which other websites to infer the social networks of blogs and stuff like that. So it's an approach that has been used for these large-scale analyses on the web, and now we're able, but are perfectly suited for turning to these more social science research questions of gun violence and criminal social networks. So to do this, we modeled gun violence both based on endogenous and exogenous components, based on the endogenous component, of course, being the social contagion, and thinking about if we were to see contagion from one individual to another, where, and again, just to be clear, contagion meaning that one individual's trait or behavior is influencing the trait or behavior of another person. So in this case, being that when one person is shot, their friends or associates are then themselves more likely in the immediate aftermath of that to be shot. So it's this contagion of victimization, not necessarily by, and when we say spreading of gun violence, it's not that you are spreading gun violence to another individual by literally, it's not about who pulls the trigger, it's about exposing them to the risky situations, the risky behaviors, and the risky contacts that led to yourself being shot in the first place. So we model this contagion based on two factors, following pretty standard epidemiological approaches. One is time, in that your influence after being shot on another person decreases over time. In the immediate aftermath of a shooting, we believe it is most contagious. Someone is most likely to kind of catch gun violence from their friend. And second, from network structure, in that you have more influence over a close friend than over a further distant friend. And we do that based on the network structure, depending on how close you are to someone in the network. So we were able to calibrate this model to the network to determine the dynamic patterns of gun violence and start to see where we see contagion, how we see gun violence spreading through the network. So first we wanted to see, just how much do we see evidence of contagion? What do these patterns look like? And we found that social contagion was responsible for over 60% of the victimizations, which means that we think that the combined effect of all of their associates who had previously been shot has a larger impact and was a larger cause of them being shot than sort of other factors based on the time of year or their own personal characteristics. So this suggests an incredibly strong impact of contagion and of the social networks and social structure in terms of determining how gun violence spreads. we found, on average, we were able to determine the individual who had the most influence on someone, who had the most influence on exposing them to these risky situations and behaviors. An incubation period of between 3 to 4 months, suggesting that there's kind of a short period after a shooting during which that the victim's associates are most likely to be shot themselves. And we found over 600 cascades, which mean series of events, and there are 3 of them on these plots behind me, where one shooting, one person was victimized, and then that person exposed further associates to victimization, which exposed further and further people. So each of these dots on the networks you see behind me are an individual who was shot, and the arrows point to other individuals who were infected with gun violence, so to speak, because of the one above them. So there were hundreds of these victimizations, and many times in hundreds of these cascades, often in relatively large networks, going up to almost 500 individuals. The last test, it's one thing to see contagion and see these patterns. The next thing is, can we use these findings to help us predict who's going to be shot next? And we found really promising results. We compared 3 different models. One is the contagion model that I was just describing, and we compared that to a demographics model that takes more of your traditional risk factors approach that considers, age, race, gang membership, and things like that. We found that the contagion model was able to predict victimization about 24% better in terms of predicting who is going to be shot on a given day. And by combining these 2 models together, you were able to get even better results, 50% increase over the demographics model alone. So this is pretty remarkable in that this contagion model, which knows nothing about who you are, it only knows your place in the social network, and when other individuals in that network have been shot, that's able to outperform a model that knows all of these other risk factors. And of course, combining all of this information together has even greater gains. So this suggests a sort of new frame that we need to put around gun violence as a public health issue. We see that it follows this epidemiological approach of social contagion. And it suggests that violence prevention efforts should consider these sorts of network dynamics and these contagion events in terms of predicting who is going to be shot next. If someone is, in terms of targeting their resources to the highest risk individuals, if someone is shot and is in the emergency room, these sorts of networks approaches can help determine who is at immediate risk over the next week or month or half a year of being shot so that preventative social services can be deployed to these individuals. And there are a lot of course, if we think about this as a public health issue, there are a lot of great public health strategies that have been deployed for dealing with other epidemics. And so this sort of frame, I think, has a lot of promise for this issue of gun violence. I'll just quickly conclude by talking about this future of data and technology in criminal justice. There's obviously a lot of excitement and studies like this one that show great promise, but there are also a lot of new risks in terms of data and analytics and new technology in policing and gun violence. We see that predictive policing can have biases based on the data that it uses, and too often these sorts of technological approaches are seen as innovative and can mask the sorts of biases that they're creating. So it's important for communities such as this one to be on the front lines, not just of developing innovative new approaches like the one I just described, but also in ensuring that their deployment and the policies that govern these new approaches, whether it's predictive policing or body cameras, are used to improve our communities and reduce trauma. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ben. Danielle Wallace.
Thank you. Okay, my apologies. I thought I had to open there it is. All right, good afternoon, everybody. I'm going to talk about distance and legitimacy in Project Safe Neighborhood Chicago, and specifically about the offender notification forms that we conducted out there. This work is collaborative with Andy Papachristos and Tracy Mears at Yale and Jeff Fagan at Columbia. So I don't want to beat to death what focused deterrence is. We're going to, I'm sure, hear a lot about it today. But focused deterrence very simply is a very specific message aimed at informing high-risk offenders of the consequences of their future criminality. We let them know that we've got some interventions that we will invoke should we find them committing future crime, and that the violence in these communities isn't tolerated or wanted. And what we're going to do is, for me, I'm going to talk a little bit about how PSN, better? Okay. Is that better, everyone? Okay. How PSN imbued procedural justice and legitimacy into their focused deterrence message to change how that message works. So what's the effective of deterrence generally? So if you let people know that their actions will be met with swift, severe, and certain punishment, we should be expecting that they obey the law. But this doesn't work that way, at least not for the individuals that the focused deterrence message is intended to reach. So these are the individuals that are committing the most crime, that are causing the most amount of violence in communities that have a lot of violence in them. And why might this be the case? We have to think about where focused deterrence messages are happening, where these interventions are happening. These are interventions aimed at gang members, gun felons, people that live in disadvantaged neighborhoods that are prone to violence, or the neighborhoods themselves are prone to violence. These are neighborhoods that have a lot of over-policing, and interaction with law enforcement is common. These are also minority neighborhoods. So while these individuals that a focused deterrence message is targeting are committing a lot of crime, they are also likely to have a lot of contact with criminal justice agents, right? They are more likely to be stopped, frisked, pulled over. They're more likely to have experienced or say that they've experienced some type of discrimination through criminal justice actors. And they're also likely to have negative contact with the police. So a deterrence message says we're going to punish you if you do not obey the law. The deterrence message is also that if an individual has fear of the consequences of the law, that they should be obeying crime. The problem here is that for these individuals, they have consequences whether or not they obey crime, right, or they obey the law. They're having contact whether or not they've done anything, right? So why would they obey at all? So in this sense, they're damned if you do, damned if you don't. So we have to, in order to get this message to work, right, the focused deterrence message to work, we have to in some way change the tone, change the message, and most importantly, change the contact so that when they do have contact, it isn't negative. So this is what Chicago PSN tried to do. So the goal of Chicago, Project Safe Neighborhoods PSN Chicago, was to reduce gun violence. So we did it through a number of ways, and I'll talk about that in a split second. But the goal of the offender notification form, which was part of PSN Chicago, was to enhance that focused deterrence message and change that message in a way, and that contact in a way that imbued legitimacy and procedural justice within it. So we're going to hear, we've already heard about procedural justice and legitimacy today, but let me just offer a super brief definition so that everybody's on the same page. So procedural justice is when interactions when law enforcement, they're not perverted in some way. It's that no one group gets more interactions, no one group gets less, right? It's procedurally fair, it's just, and it's delivered in an unbiased, there's no partiality when it's delivered. Legitimacy, on the other hand, is when individuals see the criminal justice system and its actors as fair and just. They believe that those actors have the authority to enforce the law. So procedural justice is a precursor to legitimacy. Once things are administered fairly in a just manner, in an impartial way, then people start believing that the law enforcement community and the criminal justice actors in general have the authority to actually enforce the law, and that's when trust begins to occur. So what we did is offender notifications forms. This is this idea where we deliver a targeted deterrence message that we try to get individuals to comply and not perpetuate gun violence in these very violent-prone neighborhoods in Chicago. So we did offender notification forms in a very traditional way and a not so traditional way. So the traditional way is we targeted active offenders. These were individuals that were known by authorities to likely be gang members or have gun violence in their past. We did it through these forms that were 1-hour meetings. We tried to keep them as brief as possible because we know, captive audience for an hour is really difficult. I apologize to you. So we also brought in law enforcement, community stakeholders, service providers, and active offenders to talk about their experiences. We had around 25 individuals recently released from prison, were a part of the forum every month. They were picked to be participants in this forum based on where they lived, right? They lived in the communities we were targeting. They had at least one prior gun-related or violent offense in their criminal records, and they were just released from prison within 6 months. So the difference here is when we delivered this message, the messaging in some way was different. So this is what we changed. So, well, let me back up a second. Let me just tell you what the classic focused deterrence message is. And it's basically, we're going to pull every lever. The violence needs to stop in your community. We're not going to tolerate it anymore. And everybody's been put on notice that if you reoffend, we are going to work together with multiple agencies and law enforcement and address the violence in the area. And when that violence does happen, the classic line of we're going to pull every lever we have available to us to make sure that there's a crackdown on this type of behavior. Okay, so where PSN Chicago did something different is we wanted to change the tone and the quality of the interactions with criminal justice agents. So we did this in a particular way, and mostly through kind of less of the content of the message and how the message was delivered. So first, our forums were structured and held in the round so that everybody sat at the same table. Everybody sat eye to eye. There wasn't somebody like me talking at you, right? So it made people feel equitable and sitting at the same table, right? It wasn't just kind of this lecture, so to speak. They had, the participants in PSN had been getting lectures for some time, I'm sure. So at this point in time, we made everybody kind of sit together at this table and talk openly in a setting that wasn't necessarily authoritarian, where somebody stands up front and talks at you. We made sure that the forums themselves were on neutral grounds. They were held in places of civic importance. So it was churches, community colleges, recreation centers, and they were held in the community in which we were targeting. So it was easy for the offenders to get to, but it was also something that they recognized as a neutral space. We weren't taking them down to the district headquarters and holding the forum there, right? It was a neutral ground that said to them, this is your place, this is your community, you belong in it, and you have a seat at the table in helping stop the violence that's happening here. Finally, when law enforcement agents delivered their message, it wasn't a scared straight kind of message where it was very much like, we're going to pull every lever and we're going to come and get you. It was tempered in some way with, we don't want this violence to continue. We want to stop it. We don't want to see you on a stretcher. We don't want to see shootings continue to happen. We're here to help. We want your input. We're just here to tell you what's going to happen. But in reality, we're going to give you some resources right now that will help you desist. So, and soon after that message was delivered, we had community, individuals within the community that say had positions open and were willing to hire felons. An individual, for example, would come in and say, here's the form you need to go get your ID, because I know you don't have any ID given that you just got out of prison. Here's other information that you need to be successful once released into the community. Offenders walked away, or participants rather, walked away with a folder stuffed with flyers on local information about what they needed to be successful. And by local, I mean in their community, not 2 or 3 different bus transfers to get downtown, right? They don't have cash for that, right? It was right there available to them, that was around them, that they might not have known of previously. So what this study did, obviously, is we're going to examine how this procedural justice legitimacy imbued focused deterrence message, 3, okay, impacted people's desistance. How about this? If you guys have questions about the data and how I did this, why don't you come and ask me later? That'll probably make for a more interesting talk anyway. So let's just get to the results. So within a particular neighborhood that we targeted, what we saw was that individuals who attended a forum were not only able to stay on the street longer, but they had a lower risk of failing, meaning they weren't as likely to go be reincarcerated as anybody else in the neighborhood that were similar to them. All right, so the other gun offenders or violent offenders in that community were much more likely to fail and be reincarcerated than individuals that attended our forum. And that was within the neighborhoods that we targeted. If we looked at this relationship across the city, we saw the same pattern, which is excellent, right? That our forum participants were faring better than people that didn't attend. They stayed on the street longer and were less likely to fail. Finally, we have some other results. Attending a forum also was great in that it lowered the risk of a new violation. So if people were reincarcerated, if they did fail, they were going back for a technical violation. They weren't going back because they were creating more violence in the community. The forum attendees, when they did commit a new crime, the forum attendees also were less likely to engage in the types of crimes that we were working towards stopping. They had a 9% lower risk, for example, of committing a weapons crime. The same for murder and other violent crimes. So we felt successful in a number of avenues and a number of levels. So very simply, a quick summary is pairing a focused deterrence message with legitimacy and procedural justice aspects allowed us to be successful in a number of ways. Participants stayed out of prison longer. They were less likely to commit a new crime, and when they did commit that new crime, they were less likely to commit violent gun-related crimes. Thus, we can say that individuals that were targeted with focused deterrence strategies with legitimacy and procedural justice, we were able to have some effect on their negative perceptions of criminal justice actors. And with that messaging, we were able to alter those perceptions, and those perceptions moved on to help them desist from future criminal activity in some of the worst neighborhoods in Chicago. Thank you.
Thanks, Danielle. And finally, George Wood.
Hello, everybody. I'm a postdoctoral associate at Yale, and I'm going to talk today about our evaluation of the violence reduction strategy in Chicago. Typically, the violence reduction strategies are evaluated by looking at where did this implementation take place in space, what happened to gun violence victimization rates afterwards, compared with before, or compared with areas that did not have any intervention. What we're setting out to do in this is to instead look at it through more social networks perspective and look at the individuals who were treated or attended a call-in session, and what happened to their victimization rates afterwards, and what happened to the victimization rates of those with whom they're connected. So there's a few complications which I'll go into early and get them out of the way with, which is that VRS works by inviting people who are perceived or calculated to be at high risk of victimization to a call-in session. At that session, they're delivered a individualized message, which usually consists of some kind of warning about their risk. It consists of other deterrence messages, and they're exposed to, in some cases, people who are related to or who have themselves been victims of gunshot violence. And the idea is to try and essentially invoke some kind of behavioral shift, which means that they might try to or change their behavior in such a way that lowers their risk of gunshot victimization. But the call-ins are non-randomly assigned, which is difficult from a scientific point of view because it makes evaluating the effects of it very difficult, because the people that have attended a call-in session are at higher risk by virtue of their attendance. That's why they've been invited. And it's also, our evaluation is in a network setting. So it's not this simple case of finding a treated group, a control group, and looking at the outcomes. Because what we want to also see is what happened to the people with whom they're connected through the co-arrest network, as Ben described earlier. So potentially, not only are the blue individuals that attended a call-in exposed or could have a treatment effect, so could the people with whom they're connected, by virtue of the message spreading or of being exposed to a similar type of information. And we call this the zeroth order effect, which is for the people who are actually attended call-ins, and the first order effects for the people who are exposed to those people. Not only could they be exposed, but they could be multiply exposed. So in the case of the bottom, that person knows one person that attended a call-in session, whereas the person in the middle knows two people that attended a call-in sessions. They're doubly exposed. So we have to factor this in our evaluation. In fact, what's quite surprising about this, and really what is the power of social networks in this respect, is that of the 1,600 or so people that have attended a call-in session, more than 10,000 people have been exposed at one order to that message, or they're potentially exposed. And this is what the full network looks like. You can probably not really tell very well, but the blue individuals are the ones that are the people that have attended a call-in, and the orange are all of those people. They're potentially exposed. They know the person that attended a call-in session, and there are lots of them. Then, to sort of give you the methodological details, we isolate all the exposed people, we identify them, and we find all the unexposed people in the Chicago arrest network, and we match them up so that so they have the same attributes, so we can compare the outcomes. We do this on age, match them all up on age, race and ethnicity, gender, gang, their prior non-fatal victimizations before being called in, prior violence-related arrests, and a count of their co-arrestees. And then we use this sort of type of survival model called an accelerated failure time model. And the quantity of interest here is how long is it until this individual has a failure event in terms of the accelerated failure time model. And we're looking specifically at events of gunshot victimization. We'll also look at violence-related arrests and weapons arrests. What we want to know is, essentially, do the individuals that attended a call-in session, the I node, do they generally have, on average, a longer time to failure than those who are in the control? And similarly, what about the J nodes, the people that are exposed by the spread of the message, who did not attend a call-in? And this is what we found. So it might be a little bit difficult to see, but essentially the dotted line down the sort of vertical line is basically what would happen if there was absolutely no effect of any of these parameters. Like they didn't do anything. They didn't lengthen the time to gunshot victimization. They didn't shorten the time to victimization. And what we find is the usual sort of characteristics are all there. White individuals, white people, have much longer time to victimization on average, victimized at lower rates. And zooming in a little bit, there's males that have a much shorter victimization, they victimize more often. Members of gangs are generally recipients of, they suffer more gunshot victimization. But what's really interesting is the effects of this program, of the VRS intervention, on an individual level. Now, what we find is that being exposed to the message, not by attending a call-in, but by knowing somebody that attended a call-in, lengthens or extends the time to victimization by an average of 1.4 times. So if you were to imagine that the average time to victimization in this group is 1,000 days, if the person is exposed to the message, it jumps to 1,400 days. Of course, this is an average. Some of the people will never be shot, will never be victimized. But on average of those that are, they're victimized much later. It slows the victimization process, and in some cases actually defers it entirely. Whereas the I nodes, surprisingly, actually shortens their victimization time. So the people that attended a call-in session, at least as our model represents it, they're actually victimized more often than people who have not attended a call-in session and not exposed to any messaging, which is quite a counter sort of intuitive finding. Now, this could be for a number of reasons that have nothing to do with the actual effects of the message exposure and of attending a call-in session. It could be simply the match isn't there. So in effect, all we found is that people who attended a call-in are at higher risk, which we knew already. That's why they got called in. If we're not matching them up correctly, or if our matching is not satisfactory, we can't discriminate between whether this is actually shortening the time to victimization or not. But still, the thing to note is there's a lot more J nodes than I nodes. For every I node, there's many, many J nodes. There's many people who are exposed at a distance 1 to the exposure message. So overall, this is a big reduction in gunshot victimization rates. Violence-related arrest, it lengthens it in both cases. So about 1.5 times longer average time to the next violence-related arrest if you were exposed to the message through a call-in attendee, and just over, about 1.05 times if you would actually attended a call-in session. It's deferring violence-related arrests across the board, not only for those that are attending a call-in session, but for the more than 10,000 people that are exposed to a call-in session message. Weapons arrests, we have the same story almost exactly as gunshot victimization, which is that, again, those who are exposed at a distance 1 are lengthened, and some shortening of time to a weapons arrest for people who attended a call-in session. So what I think is important here is to emphasize that, in a sense, this is the flip side to what Ben found. It's a flip side to this spillover or this contagion of gunshot victimization. So if somebody being victimized in your network can increase your risk of victimization, well, maybe somebody being exposed to a message and being exposed to resources to try and lower their victimization rates can also lower your victimization rates if just somebody you know is exposed to those messages. So in a sense, it's the flip side. And for every one node that is exposed, that attends a call-in, there are an average of 7.9 other individuals, who are potentially exposed to this message through their social network. So the big picture here is the individuals that are attending a call-in session are only one small actual proportion of those in total who are being exposed to the violence reduction strategy. And this is a very potentially powerful fact that you can spread interventions beyond the small number that your resources allow you to expose or to bring in. You can spread it. You can spread it out multiplicably across much larger groups. And as Ben found, the victimization cascades, well, victimization reduction spills over. So it really is the flip side. And as Thomas mentioned in the introduction, this is about thinking about getting in proactively before people are victimized. Finding individuals that are at somewhat heightened risk and attempting to bring them in and give them the access to resources that they need that might help their risk be lowered. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you so much, George. So now we'll start taking some questions, and I'll begin with one of my own. For each of the panelists, please give us one practical policy implication from which this research leads. And to give you some time, I'll begin with myself. So I think that the paper that Chris and I did, what works in reducing community violence, I think there were two big takeaways. I think the first was that with regard to violence, there are many constituencies who say work on violence from the outside in. They say, if you want to work on violence, you've got to work on, first you've got to work on guns. First you've got to work on poverty. First you've got to work on jobs. First you've got to work on housing. All of these different things. And I think that what Chris and I learned by assembling all of this causal evidence about interventions was, in fact, it's the opposite. The most effective anti-violence interventions are the ones that work directly on violence, with the most violent people, in the most violent places, and focusing on the most violent behaviors. That doesn't mean I'm personally a committed political progressive. I believe in all of those other things anyway. But in terms of how best to address this problem specifically, that specificity element of effectiveness is critical. And then I think the second implication was just by marshaling all the evidence and putting it in one place, we saw that there are programs that individually, and many of you have witnessed this in your own professional lives, that can in fact be successful either on their own or as a package or of broader set of initiatives. So we hope that was sort of an optimistic takeaway, because there is often a lot of pessimism in this area. It says nothing works, and fortunately the evidence doesn't show that.
So I think I'll give an answer in terms of implications, both at an immediate low level and then at a higher policy and kind of ideological level. On a low level, the sorts of prediction techniques and dynamics that my paper studied can really help us in terms of trying to target resources with all of these violence reduction efforts that are kind of growing today. One of the major issues is who to target and how do we manage the limited resources that we have to identify the people who are at highest risk, not just in general, but right now, this week or this month. And so understanding the temporal dynamics and the cascade patterns is really important for identifying individuals who are at risk at an immediate level, because maybe one or multiple of their associates or friends of friends have recently been shot. So even though on a more demographic profile, they may not seem to be the highest risk individuals on this sort of network lens, they are actually, right now at the highest risk. So in terms of targeting those resources, it can be incredibly helpful, as well as for understanding, where with future work building on top of this to understand not just who's at risk, but also where do we think large cascades will begin? If we think that this is contagious, who do we think are most likely to be the cause of that spread, or to be a cause of large spreads? And so that's a really important future research question to understand that would then have really large impacts, again, for more effectively targeting violence reduction resources. At a higher level, we see this kind of new lens on a public health approach to gun violence, understanding that is this epidemic that is really based on social structure and the kind of the social connections and behaviors that one is embedded in. And we can see that these sorts of approaches from public health can be really valuable, as George was just describing, in terms of the spillover effects, and that's something that I believe other public health approaches for very different epidemics across the world have been pretty effective in utilizing those sorts of patterns. So if we can take this broader approach and think about it as a public health issue and really view these individuals not as offenders but as victims, and see that we can't just arrest our way out of this problem, but we need to really think about what are the resources that are needed. If we see that someone's at a high risk of being shot, the answer is much more on this public health approach to think about what resources do they need to prevent trauma, to get out of these risky situations and not end up being exposed to the gun violence that they otherwise might be.
Can
Danielle?
everybody hear me? Okay. So I have two very kind of practical lessons that I saw when I sat through a number of forums in Chicago, because I went to monitor the forums and kind of make sure that they were doing what they needed to do and whatnot. So the first one is mean your message, right? If you're going to deliver a message of procedural justice and legitimacy, we want to help, things like that, you need to mean it, right? The idea of actions speak louder than words, right? So if you say you're going to help these individuals desist from crime, give them the ability to do so, not later, but then, right then, in that meeting, right? Come informed with things you can give them to help. It might be as simple as, here's the local substance abuse treatment center. Here's so-and-so down the street that I know has hired felons in the past. Whatever it is, be there to help and help immediately. Don't just have empty words, because that is not the way to continue to embed trust in law enforcement and criminal justice actors. The other thing is, I would say, is whatever message you're trying to deliver, don't let the message slip. Stay on your message 100%, right? We have roles. We all have these roles that we play, right? We've seen a lot already today about how policing culture, for example, has been more towards law enforcement versus community-oriented, for example. It's so easy for us to slip back into the roles that we've been playing for any number of years. We saw a handful of times the forums would, all of a sudden, law enforcement would start really, instead of doing the carrot, they were giving the stick, rather, the whole carrot and stick routine, right? So they were always just delivering this harder law enforcement message. We had to make sure that people stayed on the message of procedural justice and legitimacy, that they didn't just fall back into the things that they knew and were comfortable with. That if you're going to try to change perceptions, you yourself have to make sure you change your message and keep that message going forward continuously. You always have to check the integrity of what you're trying to do.
So the implication, I think, or the biggest implication of our work is that we know that across the board, in so many walks of life, that our peers really matter. They matter in education, they matter just in getting information, in what we do on a day-to-day basis. They influence us and we influence them. And that's not surprising to anybody in this room. What is interesting is that we haven't strictly invoked that principle in violence interventions, or if we have, it has been as a sort of, well, we know that this will have these effects, but or that there will be these peer effects, and that this may, go beyond the people that are exposed to whatever intervention you're implementing. What you do is think a bit more formally, and I think, as Thomas mentioned in the start, think about the theory of sort of how that might happen, and how you might be able to encourage that to happen, so that people are reaching out to their friends and helping them out, and taking the resources that they've picked up from the intervention and spreading them. The implication, I think, or the largest implication would be to think about the social networks that people have. Think about their friendship groups. Think about who they're connected to, and how what you're doing with your intervention can go beyond just the people that you're strictly having FaceTime with.
Excellent. So, any questions from the audience? Excellent. Very good.
Where's she going with that?
Very good. Yes, go ahead.
Hi, I'm Carrie Howard. I'm a public defender in Palm Beach County, Florida, and I'm curious as to whether any of your research informed the quality of the messaging in terms of directly to whether it's the offender or the victim. Appreciate the effect on the peers, but I'm curious as to the direct message.
Well, go ahead.
I would say that ours is not at this moment. We haven't fed back into that at the moment. We do intend to, and we do intend to look at more specifically. We have, for example, in the VRS, there are some custom call-ins that differ in the messaging that is delivered. And we are going to evaluate those too and see whether that made a difference and what the size of difference.
Something that I actually didn't get to mention in my talk was that the individuals, the criminal justice actors that we used in our notification forms, same thing as call-ins, right? So I'm going to slip between the two words. I apologize. Is that we used not just the police. We had the Cook County State's Attorney's Office there. We had the state attorney office representatives there. We had police district commanders. We had ATF. Basically anybody that's going to be involved in a case involving a gun was there to speak at this forum. So, well, the message for our call-in had kind of a prototypical setup. It came from such a large variety of actors that I think the message itself and how it was delivered in that tone, you know, we will pull every lever, but we actually don't want to. You know, we don't want to see you again, really. Came from not just the police, but our local state's attorney's office and things like that, that I do think that was an aspect of quality that was enhanced in our particular program, so for our offenders.
Thank you.
Hey, thank you guys for sharing. So I was just curious, a question for Ben. When you studied the contagion effects, could you talk a bit about a correlation and causation in terms of if that was something you looked into and if you saw any interesting signal there? And also, when you looked at the contagion, did you notice anything, differences between conflicts that occurred over, say, economic disputes versus romantic disputes or otherwise?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so to the first point, we did look at those sorts of issues around causation, trying to look at confounding and homophily and other factors that might look like contagion but would in fact be other effects. And we did find that those other factors were kind of insufficient to explain the dynamics that we saw, and just the level of temporal clustering that we saw between neighbors in the network, which suggests that while those are, you know, surely at play, they're not enough to kind of explain away the contagion effects that we're seeing, as well as thinking about the ability to predict future outcomes definitely kind of led us to believe that this is both something that we can think about empirically, but also that's a valuable frame in terms of interventions and being able to respond and allocate resources more effectively. To your second point, we didn't actually look at that in terms of distinguishing the types of arrests or anything like that. And again, contagion is not based necessarily on conflict. It's not that one person infects another because they're in conflict with each other. It's that they are, they're individuals who have been arrested together, which often suggests they have a close relationship. And
more likely
Co-offenders.
more likely the opposite.
Right.
That they would join a conflict on behalf of someone else. Right.
Right, but I think there's some really interesting next steps to look at in terms of, especially thinking about other types of networks and thinking about how that layers on top of these co-offending networks, but looking at more specifically trying to break down the different individuals in these networks and thinking about, family, church, friendship, gang membership, these things that could either lead to increased risk of violence or on the flip side, these sorts of protective networks and decrease the risks. And then how these different networks layer on top of each other is going to be really interesting to look at.
Hi there. Ben, I think you began to speak to, I think was close to a question I had, so I actually have two. Ben, one for you is really around how, so the innovation in academic circles around describing violence as a contagion has been growing. And you can, as many talks as I've been to that make the analogy, it's compelling in academic circles. But when you take that knowledge, right, when you introduce it to the media, unfortunately that message, though compelling academically for research purposes, I think it reifies pathologizing communities, right? And when you describe communities in terms of disease and in pathogens, it rings, you know, there's such compelling, meaningful tools that public health can give us, like this analysis and epidemiology, but on the other hand, how can communities be empowered by that knowledge in ways that actually lift up, you mentioned protective factors and things that, so that's a real tension and it's a real challenge, and I think that there are organizations that have been working to figure out what messaging, how can you take the research and the science, but allow the messaging out in the world be different. So, and it's hard because, you know, you have titles of papers that say, folks in, that use this messaging. So there's a tension there that I wanted to address for you. And then for Thomas, it's likewise, I think this question about, for advocates, there are a lot of advocates who do make the link between, extrapolate that the way you address violence is by focusing on jobs and on housing, and there are so many upstream things that can be done to address, and I think that those certainly are true, but I think you're making a much deeper point, which is you still have to focus on violent offenders, right? Like there's, it is what it is, and you can't kind of leave that part out, and there are these risk factors, and so likewise, I think wrestle with us on, how you articulate this to advocates who are relaying these messages, and whether the science is there or not, need strong messages to then go and advocate.
Right.
Yeah, I think that's a really great point, probably something that I haven't grappled with enough, or at least not sufficiently enough. I think, one answer is that the response to these sorts of analyses and the findings that we can get can help drive maybe the public perception around them. And if we see it in terms of, do we model it, do we think about this as an epidemic and find the high-risk individuals, and do we go to them with police and say that we're watching you and we think that you're going to commit a crime, or do we go to them and say, we think you're at risk, we see that you're vulnerable, we want to reduce this trauma? And so in a lot of ways, I think the response can really help to change how we think about these individuals and what this pattern means. And I think, to my last point in my talk, we see these sorts of battles playing out around predictive policing, around heat lists, around body cameras, and it's, the technologies are often put up as, these can do these great things, but really it's the deployment, who controls the access to them, and what are the, nitty-gritty policies of how these things get used often have vastly different impacts, even if the technical details are identical.
That's right. Yeah, exactly. And I'm going to push you even and say you have a responsibility as researchers to help people along in figuring those things out.
Mm-hmm. Great. Great questions. I'll actually take a shot at the first question as well. I think one thing we have to just be honest about is that we're not going to be able to explain away violence in an entirely value neutral way. The stigma is inherent in this subject. It's a dark subject. It's a dangerous subject. And a metaphor to analogizing to a disease is one way to remove some stigma from that. But what I would suggest is, rather than trying to sort of erase the stigma of an event or a behavior that is inherently stigmatizing, I think we should follow the evidence, which is that serious violence, even in the most quote-unquote dangerous neighborhoods, is a rarity. It's perpetrated by a very small number of people in a very small number of locations. And I think it's important not to stigmatize an entire community with the behavior of a few individuals. And I think this is a key sort of messaging tool, which is we, the nonviolent many, are a large group of people. There is a small number of people who are responsible for this. And particularly when we're talking about aggressive enforcement, making sure that when aggressive enforcement is needed, it's focused on that very small number of people and not on a broader number of people. And then to the broader message of how you get that sort of message across, I think there's some encouraging science there, which wasn't covered in the paper that I talked about, but will be covered in future papers, which is that there's been some pioneering research by Raj Chetty at Harvard on income mobility. And Raj and his colleagues found a very strong association between exposure to violence as a child and lower levels of economic mobility. And then Pat Sharkey recently, in a very pioneering study, took that causal connection and through a very sophisticated analysis that I'm not going to get into here, showed that it was causal, showed that that in fact violence is a key mechanism which keeps poor kids poor. And briefly, the mechanism is trauma, which then prevents the kids from achieving effectively in school, which of course is a key economic ladder. So I think actually just marshaling the evidence and suggesting, I mean, as a progressive, we're very comfortable connecting structural factors to violence and that they lead to violence. What we don't talk enough about is that causal mechanism is operating in both directions. And in fact, violence is often one of the key things that is perpetuating poor economic outcomes, poor educational outcomes, poor health outcomes, and that violence is really keeping a lot of these people in a lot of these communities from reaching their full potential. We have a question.
Hi, Ed Chung from the Center for American Progress. Danielle, I just wanted to piggyback on, your point about making your words mean something, and especially when somebody's asking for help, right? So I'm wondering if you have any data from call-ins, and this goes to George or whoever else, from call-ins of the number of people that have actually requested assistance. Okay, and so with that reaction, I'm assuming it's a no.
We desperately wanted it.
Okay.
Yeah. The problem is what we had to rely on the social service agencies that were there at our call-ins to collect that. And those agencies were often not in a position to start a full-fledged data collection process on where their clients were coming from, unfortunately. We got anecdotal evidence that basically through conversations and stuff that it wasn't as many as we would have liked.
And it seems like the even further importance of that is if this model, which says whatever you want to say, carrot or stick, or if there are resources that are being asked for, then they need to be given and all of that. The assumption is that if they're given resources, the desistance or the time away from victimization, or however you want to characterize it, is going to be greater. So if, I would assume that that's one of the real key areas about not only the number of people who have asked for it, the quality of the services that are given, and these go back to the structural issues that we talked about this morning as well, but all of those types of things, so that when a city, if they are going to go all in on this approach, what's the model and what's the data that can support them to do so if they're going to spend millions of dollars, let's say, lowering the police budget or shifting some of that money away.
So a little bit of what Chicago did, and PSN did, which I thought was really good, and again, we don't have data on this, but we partner with University of Illinois, Chicago, to actually develop a grant writing individual who helped some of the individuals that we regularly turn to come and speak in our call-ins, to help them get grants, to bolster their services and things like that. So that's one avenue that you can take to make sure that the service providers are there for the resources that we give. But there is a little bit of work coming from sociologists like Mario Small that actually says things like just the resource itself is valuable. right? So it doesn't necessarily matter if that individual uses it, but that they have it.
So it enhances the legitimacy of the message.
Yes.
Got it. Final question.
I'm Pastor Michael Allen from Chicago, and I'm also one of the agencies. So I wanted to address the question there. Just from my own agency on the north side, I would say about 30% of the guys that we do custom notifications on reach out for help. And of those that reach out for help, I would say probably 70 to 80% of them don't reoffend at all. And so that's just one agency. I don't know. I can't speak. Here's Charles is another agency on the west side of Chicago. He might have some statistics on the top of his head. But my question to you all is, what, if any, evidence have you seen or data do you have in terms of the impact of families and how families play a role? I mean, we've talked about poverty, education, jobs, etc. But because historically, as I think about this issue, I think about the days of segregation or the days of slavery, when times were much worse, educationally, job-wise, economically, opportunity-wise, but black folks weren't killing black folks at the level we're seeing now. Violence was not such an issue in terms of black-on-black crime, violent crime, as it is now, where we have much greater opportunity, much greater educational levels, et cetera, et cetera. So my theory is there's a huge family component, but I haven't heard much conversation about that.
You're absolutely right. This is not what the PSN Chicago research addresses, but individuals who remain out of prison, there's a strong association with familial support in doing that. One of the problems that we see with incarceration and reentry and future offending, but incarceration reentry in particular, is that it's very straining on families. You remove a provider in the family, you remove somebody that provides childcare, you remove social support. It's also extremely costly to have a family member in prison. I think, for example, there was one county in Ohio that charges something like $56 for 4 minutes of telephone conversation to a family member. How can you get anything done in 4 minutes with a family member? The people are probably just handing around the phone saying hi still, but that's $56 to talk to your loved one in prison. So it's really, the family component is hugely ignored, and there's a ton of research, and I'm happy to take your card and email you some if you'd like. That shows how important family and family ties and family support is for people coming out of prison, remaining successful and desisting.
Right, and just quickly, there's a number of sort of gold star programs that have been identified by the What Works Clearinghouse and the blueprints that are in the family-oriented area. Everything from perhaps the sort of most famous evidence-based program, the Nurse Family Partnership, that works with young and expecting mothers and gives them helps them with basic parenting skills, to things like family functional therapy that really works on improving the dynamics among the family as a unit in relation to one high-risk person, and that's been successful in a number of places. And I think actually in LA they do a lot of preventive family-oriented services through the GRID program. So happy to discuss that further with you. Thank you everyone so much. I hope you appreciate the panel.